and concerns regarding the Clean Energy Incentive Program. So we're going to be talking about NTAA comments on the Clean Energy Incentive Program that we're currently working to make sure that NTAA member tribes are represented fully in these comments. If you go to our policy response kit page, that's where you'll be able to find, hopefully by next week, NTAA's comments, as well as a policy response kit that will help your tribe supply comments to EPA on this important program. So this also includes a letter that NTAA sent in 2015 providing early comments on the Clean Energy Incentive Program before it was released as a draft program. And we also have important policy issues that we've been working on. There's a regional provision out for public comment right now, and comments are due by August 10th. So you can click here to look at comments that NTAA has submitted to EPA and submit comments for your tribe. And many of you might have heard about the Volkswagen settlement for tribes on Volkswagen's Clean Air Act violations as it relates to diesel vehicles that they had. We're actively in the process of developing comments for a tribal consultation and public comment period that are open. And so you can come back to this page on NTAA's comments as related to this important settlement. Enable tribes to access over $50 million over the next several years as beneficiaries to help reduce the NOx emissions that were released by these defeat devices that were installed in Volkswagen cars over the past several years. So that's kind of what we also have a EPA policy call coming up next week, this same day on July 28th at 2 p.m. Eastern, and we'll have some more updates for y'all on that call next week. So keep a lookout for the agenda coming out for that. At this point, I would like to stop it over to our panelists today. We've got some great speakers, and I'm glad to see all the folks now to get these tribal perspectives on the Clean Energy Incentive Program. EPA had a informational call a few days ago on the Clean Energy Incentive Program, and there's definitely a lot of interest across the country on this important issue. So I hope today's call helps your tribe and your community supply comments for this important issue. The first speaker is going to be Pilar Thomas, who is a member of the NTAA Policy Advisory Committee, and she's of counsel of Lewis, Rocco, Rothsberger, Christie, LLP in Tucson, Arizona. She provides strategic legal advice to tribal governments and tribal enterprises on energy, planning and policy, renewable energy project development, and finance, including federal and state energy, regulatory programs, and policy efforts. Ms. Thomas previously served as the Deputy Director, Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs at the U.S. Department of Energy. Over the course of her 12-year career as an attorney, Ms. Thomas has served as the Deputy Solicitor for Indian Affairs in the U.S. Department of the Interior. She was of counsel at Lewis & Rocca, LLP, interim attorney, and Chief of Staff for the Pasquayaqui Tribe, and a tribal attorney in the U.S. Department of Justice. Prior to her law practice, Ms. Thomas worked for 15 years in the financial services industry for a Fortune 500 company. Ms. Thomas received her JD from the University of New Mexico School of Law, magna cum laude, and her BA in economics from Stanford University. Also, we have Sarah Drescher. She's an attorney for the Forest County Potawatomi community, in-house environmental and energy attorney, based in the tribe's Milwaukee office. Ms. Drescher's energy work spans a range of issues related to the tribe's green initiatives, including development and implementation of clean energy projects, and helping shape local, regional, and national clean energy policy. Ms. Drescher leads legal strategies in all matters related to the tribe's energy and environmental initiatives, including the tribe's Class 1 air program and its 3 megawatt anaerobic digestive power plant. Prior to joining the Forest County Potawatomi Community Legal Department, Ms. Drescher worked in the Milwaukee offices of 2 national law firms representing a variety of clients in the areas of environmental and energy law. Ms. Drescher and JD from Marquette University and is working to complete her PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. So glad she could take time away to do this work to join us on the call. I'm going to turn it over to Pilar to get us started. And just to note, we were going to have another speaker, Janet Gagnon from Blue Lake Rancheria, but I heard from her late last night. She had a family emergency and was unable to join our webinar today. So we're very sad to not be able to hear from her, but I do hope to pass along her comments on our website. We will have this webinar recorded and posted on our website. So if you know someone who couldn't make it on the call, please let them know, and we will be sure to let them know. At this point, Pilar, and Pilar, I'm going to show your computer screen so you can get your presentation started.
I'm about to lunch. Okay, thank you, Andy. Can you hear me okay?
Hello, Pilar?
Can you hear me? Hello? What happened?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, all right, sorry about that.
Yes,
I wanted to make sure. Okay. Well, good morning / afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the National Tribal Air Association's webinar presentation and overview of the EPA's proposed design rules for the Clean Energy Incentive Program. Today we're going to go through and we will be talking about an overview of the rules themselves, review of the comments, proposed comments that we're working on right now for the National Tribal Air Association. And then Sarah is going to talk about the view from Forest County Potawatomi community's perspective, and hopefully also be able to talk a little bit about some of the potential Forest County may be submitting. And at the end, we'll have an open discussion and question and answer session for myself or for Sarah or for Andy. But we certainly want to be able to use this as an opportunity to hear from tribes who are paying attention to this, who have an interest in this rule and in this issue. And one of the things that we did back in January with Forest County, in fact, and Blue Lake Rancheria was try and determine what level of interest there is in Indian country for submitting comment on this proposed rule. I think the first time the rule was potential rule issued, NTAA and Forest County were, by my count, the only tribal entities that submitted comments on the CEIP. So we're hoping to increase that and get more tribes commenting on these rules, especially since there have been some changes or some additions, maybe more accurately, that are seeking to use the CEIP as a way to continue to promote energy development, clean energy, and energy efficiency development on tribal lands. So I'm just going to go through here the background of CEIP and a summary of the rules that are most relevant to Indian country. The CEIP, Clean Energy Incentive Plan, was originally proposed as part of the EPA's Clean Power Plan back in October 2015 was when the final rule was issued. And as many of you know, the Clean Power Plan has been stayed by the U.S. Supreme Court. So all of the timelines and all of the deadlines that were part of the proposed rule have now been stayed, and effectively some states have decided to keep working on this plan, others have not. But the CEIP as a portion of that plan, the EPA has determined that it can keep moving forward with developing the proposed design rules for this. The CEIP itself is designed to work, or appears to be designed to work in conjunction with EPA's proposed emission trading schemes, which are also a part of the Clean Power Plan, and were proposed rules around those emission trading schemes were also published in October of 2015. Those emission trading schemes were also included as part of a federal implementation plan that the EPA has also proposed. And so all of these parts, primarily appear to be designed to work together. Those emission trading schemes are both the mass-based scheme and the rate-based scheme. And for information about those, I would talk to Andy or myself or Sarah on how those emission trading schemes are designed to work, or take a look at the proposed rule on the EPA's Clean Power Plan website. The CEIP itself, though, is voluntary, and states don't have to adopt it as part of their state implementation plan. But if they do adopt a CEIP as part of their state implementation plan, then they're going to have to follow the proposed rules and regulations that EPA has as part of the design features of the CEIP. And EPA has indicated that they do intend to include a CEIP as part of the federal implementation plan that they may have to develop for either a state or for 3 tribes that do have affected generating units, EGUs. Well, E doesn't stand for effective. E is electricity generating units, but 3 tribes have EGUs, electric generating units, on their tribal lands: Navajo, Fort Mojave, and the Utah Utes, or the Uinta and Ouray reservation Utes in Utah. So those 3 tribes and those 3 reservations covered by a federal implementation plan. That's part of the EPA's proposed rule, and so the CEIP, as EPA has indicated, would be included in any federal implementation plan, whether done by the state or for the tribes. All the goals of the rule, the CEIP, and the incentives involved here are really to incentivize early deployment of renewable energy and energy efficiency projects to help states meet their compliance goals as part of the Clean Power Plan. And so the proposal really is trying to jumpstart, if you will, the deployment of renewable energy and the deployment of energy efficiency so that carbon emission reductions in those early years can be achieved through renewable energy or energy efficiency projects. And in addition to jump-starting the early deployment of projects to meet compliance goals, EPA is also trying to promote energy efficiency development and deployment in low-income communities. And that's primarily because, of course, low-income communities, including tribal communities, bear the brunt of carbon emissions, they bear the brunt of air pollution, and they're bearing the brunt of climate change impacts. And so, pursuant to EPA's environmental justice goals and principles, as well as trying to ensure that low-income communities are benefiting from investment in energy efficiency projects, the goal of the CEIP is to focus energy efficiency benefits on low-income communities. The incentives that the CEIP is creating to meet these goals and to meet these objectives is through matching allowances, or ERCs. ERCs stand for emission reduction credits. Matching those ERCs or allowances that a state may award to a project under an emission trading scheme with these early action ERCs, or early action allowances for renewable energy. So under the idea of the emission trading scheme, there's some other presentations do a really good job of laying out how these are designed to work. But the basic idea is if you produce 1 megawatt hour of solar power, then you may be eligible for, we'll just say 1 ERC, 1 emission reduction credit, and we'll just say 1 allowance because I'm a lawyer and math is hard to do, so 1 is easy. So 1 ERC or 1 allowance for every 1 megawatt hour of production of solar. In this case, what the EPA is proposing is to match that allowance or that ERC with this early action. So instead of getting 1, you get 2. And so that's the incentive behind the early deployment of renewable energy. On the energy efficiency side, the idea is to double match. So instead of getting 2, you get 4. And the double matching occurs for energy efficiency projects that are in low-income communities. EPA has proposed, as part of the incentive, their match that based on the amount of carbon emission reductions, both overall and by state, they've created a pool of ERCs and allowances that are about equal to 300 million short tons of carbon emissions, and those ERCs and those allowances are allocated in 2 ways. First, they're split 50-50 between the renewable energy projects and the low-income energy efficiency projects. So 150 million to renewable energy, 150 million to energy efficiency. And then they are allocated by state. So states will get a different number, and that allocation is effectively based on the state's share or its representation of its carbon reduction requirements for the whole country. So if the state of Arizona is, as an example, and these numbers aren't accurate, but this is our understanding of how the state allocation has occurred. If the state of Arizona has is 5% of the total emissions that have to be reduced across the whole country, then Arizona will get 5% of these matching ERCs or allowances. The EPA has produced a table which can also be accessed by on their Clean Energy Incentive Plan website. They produce a table which shows by state what the available matching allowances are, and that's for states that develop a mass-based plan, and then what the available matching ERCs are, and that's for states that have developed a rate-based plan. So the most important thing here is that the allocation is split 50-50 between renewable energy and energy efficiency, and then it is allocated at the state level based on the state's carbon reduction requirements. Some of the key highlights of the CEIP plan requirements are that, a state, when they develop a CEIP plan, and remember the states are doing these plans to comply with, they decide to do a CEIP, they've got to comply with the rules. So the rules are saying here's how you design a plan. So the first thing the state's got to do is they've got to define what is an eligible project. So within the renewable energy project space, what kind of renewable energy projects will be eligible for these early action allowances or ERCs? What kind of energy efficiency projects will be eligible? The state has to ensure that these ERCs are restricted to only projects that are generating power or producing savings for a 2-year period from January 1st, 2020 to December 31st, 2021. And that's because those are the 2 years prior to the compliance period under the Clean Power Plan or the existing compliance period. Now, to be fair to the EPA, they have acknowledged in their comments that these dates may shift primarily because of the stay of the Clean Power Plan. And so depending on the outcome of litigation, if the dates shift, then it would shift. So if the litigation results in a shifting of the compliance period, then EPA appears to be saying in their proposed rule that these dates would shift as well. So it'd be important if tribes are thinking about commenting just to clarify the date shift if that occurs. But for energy efficiency operations, those have to start by September 6, 2018. And then, again, these dates are subject to change depending on the litigation. For the real estate energy operations, those have to start by January 1st, 2020. So if you start before 2020, January 2020, you're not going to be eligible. You can only start on or after, and you've got to produce power for those 2 years. One thing the states have to do is define low-income community. And the EPA has indicated that states have a lot of flexibility. They want to give the states flexibility to do this. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means from an Indian country perspective, but the states do have to produce in their plan what their definition of low-income community is. And one of the things that EPA heard loud and clear from a lot of tribes about was ensuring that tribal lands were included in the CEIP. And so what EPA has proposed here is that the states can't prohibit projects that are located on Indian country, is the term used in the rule. So if a state sets up a CEIP, it cannot prohibit a project that's done on tribal lands from being an eligible project under the state's CEIP. With respect to the renewable energy projects piece of the CEIP, so these early action ERCs or allowances will be issued to eligible renewable energy projects that generate electricity during 2020 or 2021. The projects have commercial operation by 2020. And the original CEIP outline, EPA had looked at just wind and solar. They're now proposing to expand the renewable energy technology to include geothermal and hydropower. They had asked a question earlier about whether biomass or biogas should be included in their emission trading scheme, and they didn't ask it specifically about the Clean Energy Incentive Plan. They did ask it about the emission trading scheme. And so the EPA has not proposed to expand renewable energy resources to include biomass or biogas. The EPA has characterized the expansion to other zero carbon emission technologies, which definitely would include geothermal or hydro. And so that would be the reason why they have excluded biomass. All the comments in the proposed rule don't say explicitly why they're excluding biomass or why they're excluding biogas. I realize that because there are more tribes with biomass or biogas resources than there are tribes with geothermal hydropower resources. First of all, geothermal and hydropower take a substantial period of time to develop. Hydropower because you've got to go get licenses from FERC. Geothermal because you have to keep pushing holes in the ground until you find water. So from an Indian country perspective, the expansion into geothermal or hydropower doesn't really help any tribe. But not expanding it to biomass could in fact hurt tribes, both from a renewable energy project and from an energy efficiency perspective. So just wanted to point that out about the types of renewable energy resources that are available. So as I said earlier, the eligible energy projects include solar, wind, geothermal, hydroelectric. There's a provision in the proposed rule that says, first of all, the project can be located in Indian country. And so it's very explicit. The state can't exclude a project from Indian country. But there's also a provision that says that a project can be located outside of a state with a CEIP as long as that project benefits that state with a CEIP. So as we understand what this means, we'll use a tribe as an example. Let's say tribe A is located in the state of Arizona, and Arizona decides it's not going to do a CEIP. So the tribes in Arizona won't be able to get ERCs or allowances state of Arizona because it doesn't do a CEIP. But let's say California does a CEIP. And so if there's a project located on tribal lands in Arizona, and that project's power into the state of California, to, let's say, a utility in California, then that project is benefiting California, which has a CEIP. Therefore, the project in Arizona, the tribe in Arizona, should be eligible for the California CEIP and the early ERCs and allowances that California does. Because even though the project is not located in California, it's benefiting California. That's where the electricity is going. California has a CEIP. So the tribal project in Arizona should be an eligible project for the state of California. The rules aren't exactly clear on whether that scenario will actually work for Indian country because of this prohibition. So this is one of the comments that we'll probably be making, is that it would be helpful for it to be very clear that this other state, even though you can't prohibit, we'd want to make sure that it's clear that no matter where Indian country is, that prohibition has to be true. So we want to be able to see tribes that are in states that don't do CEIPs, but can sell power into another state that does a CEIP. We want those tribal projects in the non-CEIP state to be able to benefit in a CEIP situation with maybe an adjoining state or a state two states over, as long as that project can benefit that other state. And then lastly, this project must be connected to the grid. Of course, that's how you get the power from Arizona to California. But it's also because the way that the whole program is designed, grid-connected renewable energy projects will, by definition, offset carbon emissions, and so the connection to the grid is a necessary feature of the renewable energy project design. With respect to energy efficiency in low-income communities, here again, double early action ERCs will be issued. Project has to be operational, as I said, by September 6, 2018. And one of the things that the EPA has now proposed new is that energy efficiency projects can include what I've labeled distributed solar, but it's certainly, they've just said renewable energy solar projects. But the way they describe it, the way the EPA describes it is it's distributed solar. So it's rooftop solar or it's community-based solar. But by distributed, that means it's small scale, located on or near the facilities that are going to use the power. It does not include, right now the EPA has not proposed to add any other renewable resources that could also be distributed. So, for example, there's no indication that it would include distributed wind. And that's going to be important for tribes as well, because there are a whole host of tribes, especially in the Midwest, the upper Great Plains, and even the southern plains, where wind is just as viable, if not a more viable resource for the tribes than solar is. And so, and this would be true for anybody else in those areas, including communities. So we're probably going to be submitting in our comment included that distributed wind should also be included. Small scale wind, where and there are tribes, for example, I think White Earth has got 2 distributed wind projects that they've put in, helping to power one of their community buildings. Seneca Nation just put in a distributed wind project funded by the DOE's Office of Indian Energy to power their part of their community and offset the power of their community. So distributed wind, we think, is a kind of a big gap in the energy efficiency definition of project. But the good news is, as I said, they've expanded energy efficiency to beyond just energy savings to also include technically energy generation, but it's got to be distributed. So basic idea here, though, is for these energy efficiency projects that you have demand-side energy savings. You change your doors, your windows, you put new insulation in. It has to be in operation, and that means saving energy by September. Distributed solar is included, but it must be connected to the grid. And for tribe purposes, here's another big benefit. The definition of project proposed includes programs that are an aggregation of multiple individual projects. So here, for example, if a tribe decides to do a tribe-wide, community-wide energy efficiency program, and maybe you have, I'm just going to use easy numbers, 100 houses, and the tribal government buildings, the fire station, the senior center, the wellness center, the school, whatever you might have, let's say just a kind of a small tribal community. And the tribe decided to do a community-wide energy efficiency program, and they're able to document the savings, measure the savings. You still have to comply with all of the provisions in the plan. That whole program is considered a project under the proposed rule. And so the whole program would be eligible for early action ERCs or allowances under the CEIP. So you would not have to go to the state for every single house or for the government building or for the fire station. You go to the state to get early action ERCs for the whole program. And so that's a nice design feature that, one, certainly saves time and effort in terms of administrative and trying to capture and measure. But more importantly, it lets you aggregate these smaller projects that by themselves not be eligible for an ERC because it's not going to save a 1 megawatt hour. But altogether, these smaller projects add up to something that can be awarded ERCs and allowances. And so that's a huge benefit, and it's something I think tribes should really be thinking about when it comes to how they can really benefit from this plan through the energy efficiency aspect of it. As I said earlier, the states get to decide and determine for their plan the definition of low-income community. EPA has given them the flexibility to do that. It lets them use, the rule lets them use multiple definitions. So they can include definitions from existing federal programs, or they can use definitions from existing state programs. Those programs had to have been in place by before October 2015. And so from a certain perspective, this certainly gives states a lot of flexibility. The challenge here is that if the state decides to use a state program for its definition of low-income community, and the state doesn't do low-income programs on tribal lands, then it's unclear what would happen if the state submits this low-income definition and it by definition excludes Indian country because states don't do low-income programs in Indian country. It's the federal programs that are there. So there's a little bit of a concern here that a state may inadvertently, I mean, I'm not suggesting that they would do it on purpose, but if they choose a state program and they don't include tribes in their state program, then they may not be including tribes in their definition of low-income community. And just one example, in California, they have all these programs around environmental justice in California, but there was an example we found where the state has done some research on climate change impacts and air pollution impacts on low-income communities. And they just did a report, it was published 2 years ago, and they identified these high-risk, low-income communities, and not a single tribe was on there. So if the state of California uses their definition of low-income community, and that's a list that they produce, and there's no tribes on that list, then we could have a situation where tribes aren't included in these state CEIPs because of that. So we'll have some comments on our recommendations for that. I'll talk about that in a minute. So to summarize just real quick, the kind of the 4 or 5 areas that NTAA is most interested in and will likely be submitting comments on, including Indian country in the definition, or more importantly, not prohibiting Indian country. Huge step forward. We probably want to see a definition of Indian country because we don't to have certainty in the geographic location of what that means. Is it within reservation boundaries? Is it trust land? Is it dependent Indian communities? What's the definition? And so we'll have some recommendations on how to define Indian country. The definition of low income, as I was just saying, clarifying, and our recommendation will probably be that the EPA should define low income for the tribal lands within a state using a federal program for the definition of tribal lands or the definition of low income community, and using a single program for all the tribes. Rather than tribes being subject to a state definition that may or may not include them, our recommendation is going to be that we have a single federal definition that we know covers low-income communities for tribal lands, and that the states have to use that for Indian country. The allocation of IRCs and allowances. As I said earlier, there's these early action IRCs and allowances are split 50-50 between between renewable energy and energy efficiency, and then they're allocated by state. Indian country represents and renewable energy resources on tribal lands, according to NREL's geospatial report on the technical renewable energy potential on tribal lands, shows that tribes have about 6% of the generation capacity across the whole country for renewable energy, and that's across all technologies. So that's wind, solar, biomass, geothermal, hydropower. So 6% of all the renewable energy generation potential sits on Indian land. In our view, in order to ensure that tribes are getting their fair share of projects and fair share of allowances, we recommend a set-aside within these allowances, within the state, for the tribal land. And we recommend it at the state level, primarily because all these allowances are done at the state level, and the budget, the carbon reduction budgets are all at the state level. And also because different states certainly have different numbers of tribes, different amount of tribal land. Some states have a lot of tribal land within the state, and therefore a lot of renewable resources, and others don't. So rather than kind of a national set-aside across the whole allocation and across all the states, we took a look at some of the states with the highest budget reductions and with a lot of tribes on within their state, and so we just kind of put together some ideas of what an allocation might look like from a percentage standpoint on the renewable energy project side. So as an example, in Arizona, not including Navajo, because Navajo is going to have its own plan, but in Arizona, the rest of the tribes in Arizona represent 28% of the renewable energy potential in the state of Arizona. So if Arizona does a CEIP and they have an allocation of, let's say, 5 million allowances, then Arizona tribes should get 28% of those as a set-aside. And so that projects will flow to where the resources are. Minnesota, as another example, has 7% of the renewable energy potential. So the tribes of Minnesota should get a 7% set-aside. Montana, which has a relatively high budget, I think it actually has the highest budget requirement, the tribes there have 20% of the renewable energy potential. And North Dakota, South Dakota has the highest of all, almost 80% when you include Standing Rock, which actually straddles the line. So it seems that to be fair to Indian country, to be equitable to Indian country, to promote projects on tribal lands for these states to meet their carbon emission reduction goals, and to go to where the resources are, set aside or an further allocation for projects on tribal lands would help meet all of those goals, and the states still be able to meet their carbon reduction requirements and still be able to use their allowances. For the energy efficiency piece, our recommendation is going to be that we have a set aside based on low-income households. And this would be a formula similar to what the Department of Energy's Weatherization Assistance Program, which is a low-income household energy efficiency program run by the Department of Energy. Tribes are eligible for that grant program for their communities, and there's a formula in the statute that's basically a pro rata formula. So we would recommend that same formula for doing an allocation for low-income portion of the energy efficient portion of these allocations for tribal lands. And so that way, again, we ensure that tribal communities and low-income households on tribal communities are getting their fair share of allowances or fair share of perks for energy efficiency projects based on the percentage of the low-income community that the tribes represent in that state. Otherwise, what we will see is what we see in the Weatherization Assistance Program, which is a state gets all the funds and they don't necessarily deploy it into tribal lands, even though low-income households on tribes are included in the formula for the state. States can spend that money however they want to, and unless a tribe has a direct grant with DOE for low-income weatherization assistance, the tribes aren't seeing those funds flow into Indian country. So kind of a lesson learned here is if we're going to do something around low-income households, our recommendation is going to be that we get a set-aside that's consistent with an existing statutory formula, and we set aside the allowances so that projects, again, will go into Indian country because that's where the allowances are and the resources. With respect to the type of renewable energy, we're going to recommend the incorporation of biomass into that. There's just the tribes of 5 million megawatt hours of available biomass. Forest County has a biomass biodigester project, which under this rule would not qualify. So we think that biomass should be included, and if there's a need to limit technology so you have low emission biomass, you can do that. But it certainly excludes tribes in the Northwest, Northeast, Upper Great Plains, Southeast, and some of those tribes don't have the types of wind and solar resources, but they have biomass, and so that seems to be a comment that we're going to be presenting. As I said earlier, we want to see distributed wind and storage inside of these energy efficiency project definitions. There's just too much wind the tribes have. They ought to be able to take advantage of it as part of an energy efficiency effort, and as long as it meets the distributed and capable of net metering requirement, which wind is, then we think wind should be included, as should storage, because that's really the next big gap in technology to take advantage of intermittent wind and solar is to add a battery to that, and that should be included as well. And then lastly, we're going to renew our comment that we think the EPA should do a national federal implementation plan for Indian country inside of the Clean Power Plan itself, and then by definition, it would have a separate CEIP for Indian lands. Right now, and Sarah will talk to this in more detail because this has been really one of their primary goals, has been to try and help EPA understand that asking tribes to go in front of the states and negotiate with the states to get ERCs, to get allowances, to be involved, to get the benefits here is an affront to tribal sovereignty. And a national CEIP would allow tribes to be able to work with the EPA to do something that makes sense for Indian country and not necessarily require 335 tribes to go to their respective states and try and negotiate something at the state level. So with that, let me turn it over to Sarah and to talk about from the tribal perspective, the CEIP, and then we can go on to a question and answer period. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Pilar. And Sarah, before you get started, I just wanted to point out, Pilar had mentioned this chart showing the proposed state and tribal share of matching pool of the IRCs, and you can find it on this website here on EPA's website that has the details about the CEIP. So as Pilar said, we'll be doing question and answer after Sarah's presentation. So Sarah, I have your slideshow going on the first slide.
Terrific. You can move along to the next slide, and this is just a quick little quote. And while everybody takes a look at that, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Sarah Drescher. I am the attorney, the environmental and energy attorney for Forest County Potawatomi community. And as Pilar has indicated, the Forest County Potawatomi community has been very involved in providing comments to EPA and really in trying to put this information out there for the interest of other tribes. And I think the position I've taken, the position that the tribe has taken, is really pretty straightforward. We believe there's authority for tribes to engage directly with EPA rather than engaging through states if they don't have EGUs and if they would like to participate in the CEIP program. And basically, states simply do not have the authority to administer their rules in Indian country. And one of the things that you might notice in the CEIP proposed rules is that EPA makes a comment that because neither the Clean Power Plan nor the CEIP impose legal obligations on tribes without affected EGUs or authorize states to impose such obligations, then there's, in essence, no infringement on sovereignty. And I think that's a pretty significant oversimplification. It's problematic to recognize the lack of authority for states over tribes in several programs, and most notably the Federal Air Rules for Indian Reservations, or the FAR, very carefully and distinctly recognizes that states do not have regulatory authority over tribes. So it's problematic to recognize that in other instances, but then say that tribes should work through a state regulatory program. Solely because the CEIP program is voluntary does not mean it's not regulatory. And I think there are instances that we can point to that say that there are voluntary programs that still actually have a regulatory nature. So the very instance that a state that they enter the CEIP program, they are being a regulated or a regulating entity over tribes simply if tribes have to gain authorization to use the program through states. So we will be commenting again on these on this revised proposed rule, and I think what we will be doing is attaching our original comments. I'm going to speak primarily about some of those original comments today, and then I'm also going to dive in a little bit deeper into some of this. As introduction of the Potawatomi are part of a confederacy with the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Algonquins, and the three of them together are the Council of Three Fires, with Potawatomi being the keeper of the fire. And Andy, you can move on. The Potawatomi had ceded the majority of their lands in the Great Lakes area through a number of treaties, and eventually the Forest County Potawatomi relocated to northern Wisconsin, and in various acts were finally granted the trust lands that they now have or their reservation. Next slide. And this is a map just depicting the areas where Potawatomi is located. That larger pink area in northern Wisconsin is the reservation area. And then we also hold trust land in Milwaukee, Campbellsport, and a couple of other areas. Next slide. And Potawatomi, like all tribes, has a very distinct history of protecting and preserving the environment and watching carefully in terms of what environmental impacts mean to traditional ways of life. Next slide. The elders have communicated consistently that things are out of balance, that plants are showing up in places where they didn't used to be, animals are kind of moving to places that they didn't used to be, and that's based primarily on land use and on environmental pollution. The Potawatomi have stood up on a number of occasions to challenge different environmental instances of abuse, and several of these relate directly to Wisconsin, but several are also more national in scope. Next slide. The Potawatomi have received treatment as state status for Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, and are expanding their TAS status for the Clean Water Act. And they have also redesignated the reservation as Class 1. The Potawatomi also have a number of instances where they've worked directly with both local and national governments to influence policy. Next slide. One of the projects that the Potawatomi has used to influence their energy and influence their carbon footprint is Project Greenfire. Project Greenfire started as a project which took a baseline and developed an understanding of exactly what the carbon footprint of the tribe was. And the tribe went through each of its buildings and looked at energy consumption, and then developed plans that it could use to eliminate portions of its carbon footprint. And the initial efficiencies eliminated over 13,000 tons, and then through additional efficiencies and through upgrades, we have continued to eliminate additional tons of CO2. For everything that the tribe has not been able to eliminate at this point, it purchases RECs to offset all of its use of energy from traditional sources. Next slide. One of the things that FCPC is greatly involved in is green energy production. And one of the reasons that Potawatomi is so keenly interested in the Clean Power Plan is because the plan really does promote the development of green and renewable generation. The plan, while the plan was developed for, in order to regulate emissions and to provide emission rate goals, also has an implementation component. And part of that implementation component is intended to generate new green and renewable projects. The community has approximately 3 megawatts of renewable generation currently, a 2 megawatt biodigester in Milwaukee, and then also approximately a megawatt of community scale solar. Next slide. And these are just some pictures of the solar and biodigester. Next slide. That is the biodigester facility on the bottom of that picture. Next slide. And these are pictures of our community scale project from last year. With the community scale project, the tribe was able to, and you can go to the next slide, Andy. The tribe was able to install solar on 15 tribal buildings, and the real beauty of that is that by being able to install solar on that many sites, the tribe feels like it had a real impact on the reservation. And then in the future, the tribe is looking at small-scale biomass development in northern Wisconsin near the reservation, compressed gas, which would be associated with the biodigester, geothermal, and additional energy efficiency projects for housing. Next slide. Now, the Clean Power Plan. Why are we interested? I think that at the most fundamental level, the Clean Power Plan offers opportunities. There are opportunities for green energy growth, and there are opportunities for financial incentive based on the IRCs and allowances that tribes and other entities might be able to receive through the production of green energy or through energy efficiency measures in low-income communities. But what's important is to note that the tribes are not one size fits all. They are scattered across the United States, and with over half of the states suing to stop implementation of the Clean Power Plan, there is no certainty in terms of how that will impact the 132 tribes in the nation. The state implementation plan might work in certain instances, and if you'll note, Pilar just gave an example of why it might not work in California. The definition of low-income community in California may not be inclusive enough to include all tribes. As she stated, not a single tribe is included. So one of the problems with state implementation plans is that they are not being generated with tribal views in mind, and they may not have tribal goals and certain important elements of tribal policy considered. In addition, I think tribes have a great interest in commenting on the Clean Power Plan and the CEIP to ensure that IRCs and allowances can be generated for all types of projects, and not simply for solar and wind, but like Pilar noted, we have the biodigester, and whether or not we include biomass or compressed gas or other alternative energy features would be something that this tribe would like to see recognized in the Clean Power Plan. Another point that Pilar also made, allowances be traded in all markets. There doesn't necessarily need to be, and they need to be able to, a state or tribe that does not have a plan should be able to not only go to any other market and request that their tribe be actionable in that, or their project be actionable in that market, but there shouldn't be a barrier such as having to prove that there is a benefit to that market. And one of the problems with having to prove that benefit is that if you think about the Clean Air Act, and if you think about generally, air pollution does not stick to geographic borders. And the EPA has done a fairly good job of recognizing that. Cross-state air pollution rule would be one example. The FAR, the Federal Air Rules for Indian Reservations, may provide some support for that. But in essence, this is not something where states, in and of themselves, are creating impacts or are generating fixes that will remain within their borders. So the implementation of this as a state-by-state program without the ability of other programmatic entities to also participate may be problematic. And then the tribes certainly have a very strong interest in monetizing IRCs and allowances to promote future energy projects. I think tribes specifically have resources that are readily available to use and resources that they are already considering deployment options for. And so they may very well be able to take those projects and move them forward relatively quickly and in a way that could garner them immediate IRCs and allowances in the CEIP. Next slide. So EPA has received a couple of drafts of comments from the Forest County Potawatomi community. And the basis for these comments was tribal sovereignty. As written, the Clean Power Plan and the Clean Energy Incentive Program simply fail to recognize sovereignty. There needs to be a means of tribal implementation or a federal implementation plan that directly implicates tribes as sovereign entities. And again, going back to my initial comment, it's not enough to say that because this is a voluntary program, there aren't regulating instances. Although it's a voluntary program, states still have to create regulatory rules in order to implement their programs. So the two things are kind of mutually exclusive. In addition, the regulatory gap between allowing states to regulate tribes and tribal sovereignty is such that that is one of those things that has been fully recognized in a number of previous instances. The Clean Air Act, EPA Indian Policy, the Federal Trust Responsibility, Environmental Justice, the FAR, and any number of programs recognize the inability of states to, in fact, regulate tribes. And the Clean Power Plan very well may be problematic for tribes that have treatment as state authority. Tribes that already regulate their own air resources are unlikely to recognize the need to offer states regulatory authority. And that may limit tribes' interests in investing in their own clean energy or otherwise promote tribes' interests in participating in these projects. And one of the most salient reasons that we feel a FIP is more responsive to this issue is because it simply levels the playing field for all tribes. It takes away the uncertainty of those tribes that may be in states that do not have interest in the CEIP or who are suing for the Clean Power Plan. The nature of tribes and the nature of their environmental commitment is such that they've placed such a high importance on clean air and on energy development, green energy development, that they simply should be self-regulating. Next slide. So what we're asking is that the Clean Power Plan provides a platform for tribes that do not have EGUs to create ERCs and earn allowances through any energy efficiency and carbon-free or carbon-neutral energy projects separate from state entities. FCPC believes that EPA has the authority and that the scope of the Clean Power Plan is such that it should include those entities that actually have authority over the air resources and not necessarily authority over simply an electric generating unit. And I think the distinction there is important. The distinction is such that EGUs, as the entity that generates the carbon output, those can be regulated. But what EPA may have done in creating the Clean Power Plan is it's arguable that they've compartmentalized components of the Clean Power Plan so that this component, the CEIP, could be separable. It is, in fact, regulatory, and it is not directly associated with the EGU output, so technically could be separable from that component of the Clean Power Plan as a standalone plan. So what we're asking in terms of a FIP is to recognize exactly that, is to recognize the distinction in what those plan elements are. The vast majority of tribes currently, because they do not have EGUs, are not offered a mechanism for participation. Additionally, certain states and territories are not offered participation. Next slide. And now the next several slides go into some of the very specific legal arguments for why the Clean Power Plan should be something that tribes are authorized to enforce, regardless of whether they have EGUs. And right off the bat, under the Clean Air Act, the treatment in the same manner as a state simply provides tribes with the right and the ability to regulate their own air resources. And what FCPC is suggesting is that the TAS is the basis for why and how the Clean Power Plan can be implemented by tribes. There is nothing within the TAS standards that eliminate Clean Air Act Section 111D from oversight by tribes. So there's nothing that would prevent tribes from being able to develop standards and perform in the CEIP market for renewable energy and energy efficiency projects. Additionally, treatment as state authority oftentimes leads tribes to establish not only air quality standards, but redesignation under Class 1. So while 32 tribes have received eligibility determinations for treatment as state, currently, I believe it is only still 6 tribes that have been redesignated Class 1, but I also know that there are other tribes reaching towards that goal. But that redesignation is important. That redesignation reinforces the importance of clean air to tribes. And oftentimes those decisions are made and based on certain ethical obligations that the tribe has to its Mother Earth. And based on those obligations, tribes may have different or differing priorities than states. So again, working through a state program may not be in the best interest of a tribe. Next slide. And the Tribal Authority Rule definitively provides that EPA and tribes have clear jurisdiction in Indian country. And I don't say this to question EPA's concept of the Clean Power Plan and the CEIP in this instance in their comment in the proposed rules. But I do think that the Tribal Authority Rule can be the basis for saying exactly that states should not be the entity responsible for regulating a tribal area. And while there may be a distinction that this is a voluntary program, that again does not mean it's non-regulatory in nature. And the Tribal Authority Rule, in all of its glory, states quite clearly that federal and tribal governments have authority over Indian country and not states. And at the bottom of this slide, I think this is an important point. It is EPA's position that unless a state has explicitly demonstrated its authority and been expressly approved by EPA to implement Clean Air Act programs, EPA is the entity to be implementing Clean Air Act programs prior to tribal primacy. And this is important. I don't believe EPA, through the Clean Power Plan, is trying to create or carve out another portion of state authority. But I think that it should be considered as to whether or not the Clean Power Plan as written may purport to do exactly that. Next slide. And next, I think that this responsibility is also the responsibility of EPA to implement a federal implementation plan is also directly tiable to the federal trust responsibility. And the federal trust responsibility has been reiterated in a number of different areas. It has been incorporated in various executive orders, and EPA clearly recognizes it, cites it on its website. But the obligations under the federal trust responsibility simply suggest that EPA, as an arm of the federal government, must consider tribal rights to land, water, and natural resources. Next slide. The EPA is in essence a trustee for the tribes and has a responsibility to protect tribes' rights. And FCPC would argue that that's not only the rights of tribes to their resources, but also the rights of tribes to regulate those resources. The 1984 Indian Policy, which EPA issued for the administration of environmental programs on Indian reservations, also supports the use of a FIP or the use of tribal implementation of their own programs over aspects of the CEIP and Clean Power Plan. There are several key principles in EPA's Indian policy. Several of these make a lot of sense when thinking through the Clean Power Plan. And I'm only going to point you to one, and if you go down into the bullet points in the middle of my slide, the agency will recognize tribal governments as the primary parties for setting standards, making environmental decisions, and managing programs for reservations, consistent with agency standards and regulations. So again, that's not consistent with state standards and regulations, but consistent with agency standards. Next slide. From the 1984 Indian policy, I think the other important thing to consider is that the agency has already stated that it will take steps to encourage tribes to assume regulatory authority. Andy, can we go to the next slide? There we go. So again, as Pilar stated, they will, on behalf of NTAA, they will be creating comments that reinforce the thoughts for a federal implementation plan. And we believe that a federal implementation plan would be wholly consistent with what it is that EPA has practiced in accordance with their relationship with tribes up until this point, and that it would offer tribes the direct avenue for involvement in the Clean Power Plan and the CEIP. We think that the FAR could be an interesting model, and if you think about what the FAR is, it is basically a method for regional programmatic oversight. And maybe we don't need a regional programmatic oversight in this instance, or EPA could use regional areas as implementation mechanisms if that would make more sense to them. But in essence, the idea is that a federal implementation plan that would put the onus on tribes and the ability for tribes to operate their own programs is really fundamental in the Clean Power Plan. Next slide. And these are some of the key elements that we believe are necessary to really address tribal concerns. Pilar did discuss many of these, but I'm just going to briefly highlight a couple of them. The idea to fully include distributive generation, that goes to the idea of biomass and other types of outside of solar and wind that can provide direct benefit and green renewable energy on tribal properties, on reservation. FCPC does not believe there should be a distinction. The FCPC biodigester is a clear example of a reduction in carbon output and a reduction in use of traditional energy sources. So we would like to see that area expanded. Again, tribal customer ownership of ERCs and allowances. And this is important for a number of reasons. Many tribes, if they have tribal entities that would like to develop tribal business energy, would prefer to see their abilities be through the tribe and not necessarily through the state. So there is an inconsistency, again, with expecting tribal business entities to go up to a state to request ERCs and allowances rather than going to the tribe, who is their primary regulatory authority. The other comments that we have previously, and they're included here, we'd like to see the inclusion of combined heat and power, the inclusion of geothermal. Obviously, geothermal doesn't produce energy, but it lessens your use of traditionally produced energy. So if you're cooling and heating through geothermal, you rely less on traditionally produced energy. Next slide, please. One of the most important things, and Pilar also mentioned this, is that there must be an allocation of allowances specific to Indian country. It's not necessarily that allocation, that tribes can depend on a state program to ensure that they will be appropriately allocated allowances and IRCs. And the basis for this is really quite simple. A state program might be developed in a number of different ways. One of the ways that Pilar also mentioned is the definition of low-income community. If a state program does not include reservations in low-income community, in the definition of low-income community, tribes may not be able to receive IRCs and allowances for energy efficiency projects in the same manner as other low-income communities as defined by the state. And we think there's a basis for making this a federal definition. The hub zone regulations, a hub zone automatically includes all tribal areas, and that might be one way to create a basis for including all tribal areas as low-income community. But in addition, a state program may place emphases on the creation of various types of projects, which tribes may not be interested in creating, or they may create emphases that place production in certain areas of the state, which tribes may not have the geographic location requirement. So there are various ways where states may unknowingly be able to exclude tribes from this type of scenario. Next slide. So why does this matter? Is there a reason that this is more important to tribes than it is to any other state? And in some ways, I believe that there are various reasons. Tribes have environmental goals that are fundamentally different from state goals. Tribal goals are such that the protection of the environment is oftentimes their primary focus. And state goals may not consistently recognize that. State goals may also be such that when they create their CEIP or when they create their plans, they require, for example, that IRCs and allowances be traded only with certain other entities within the state. And if that's the case, then the tribes may be exchanging IRCs and allowances directly with an energy producer that is polluting their lands, and may be one of those environmental goals that tribes simply, and may be a reason that because of those environmental goals, tribes may not end up utilizing those IRCs and allowances. Distributive generation. Distributive generation is important. Many tribes have goals of energy independence. And while those tribes may never be considered EGUs because they may actually use all solar power or wind power or a combination of these functions, their distributive generation projects actually do create an improvement for the greater state area. So they are directly benefiting states, regions, but because they're using distributive generation, it may not be, they may not receive the same amount of recognition. The financial incentives. The IRCs and allowances, quite simply, can be monetized to help tribes pay for future projects. And without those financial incentives, it becomes rather difficult for tribes to continue to move forward in green energy. Sovereignty. And I think sovereignty is one of the most important issues for all tribes. The federal government is the primary regulatory authority in that if tribes do not have regulatory authority in a certain area, if they have not been designated as treatment as states, then it is the federal government that steps in and regulates over tribes. It is not the state governments. States do not have the authority to regulate, and tribal sovereignty is in fact impacted if states are allowed the authority to regulate. Finally, state development of plans might in fact be skewed, and we've talked about this, both Pilar and I, a couple of times. States are required to determine the definition of low income based on existing pre-October 2015 standards. So they have to choose a standard based on when Clean Power Plan was developed. And those standards are going to be different or could be different on a state-by-state basis. Those standards may not be inclusive of tribal properties. And as Pilar mentioned, the very fact that the federal government has the authority over tribes and promotes low-income projects in Indian country means that state definitions simply do not encompass those areas. And states have the flexibility to create plans that are best for the states. And what's best for the states does not necessarily mean it's best for the tribes. Next slide. And with that, I will hand it back to Andy.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much for your presentation. My mind is still spinning a little bit, but that was great. I do want to open the lines for some questions. If folks have questions, there's a couple ways that you can ask. You can either type in a question to the question box, or you can raise your hand. There's a little tab on the control panel that allows you to raise your hand, and I will unmute your line and you can ask a question. So let's stand by and see if we get any questions coming in. Okay, I've got a question coming in. Potawatomi is a Class 1 airshed. Does this factor make a difference in the CEIP potential for monetary benefit for the tribe?
I don't believe so. The tribe's Class 1 program is important to the tribe because, well, it's important to the tribe for a number of reasons based on environmental factors, but the tribe has been developing green energy in order to further support the Class 1 area and to ensure and encourage maintenance of that Class 1 area so that there are not problems with the increment. I don't think that monetarily the Clean Power Plan or Class 1 would play together in any case. But because the tribe is interested in continued development of green energy, the CEIP becomes pretty important and may provide economic incentive.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Are there any more questions? Well, if there are no other questions, we'll be ending this call then. I do just want to put on the screen EPA's informational page on the CEIP. And most importantly, there's a page here on how to comment. As I mentioned at the start of this webinar, NTAA will be finalizing comments to EPA and providing a template letter for tribes to use in submitting comments within the coming weeks. So you can see from Pilar's and Sarah's presentation, there's a lot of different points that will be made in this comment letter. So we hope that many voices will contribute to this effort to make the CEIP benefit tribes and ensure that a clean energy future moves forward. So at this point, I would like to thank again NTAA's Policy Advisory Committee member Pilar Thomas for being on the line, and Sarah Drescher from the Forest County Potawatomi. Thank you both for your time, and thanks for all the participants for listening and learning about the Clean Energy Incentive Program. At this point, this is the end of our webinar, and thanks, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you.